Hi everyone. So before all this pandemic craziness happened, I had been approached by Kate Richards, who is the recreation coordinator for the city of Chestermere, about hosting an embroidery workshop for them. We had met a few times and we set a date. It was meant to be in April, but we had to cancel it due to the pandemic, unfortunately. She later contacted me again to see if I'd be willing to make a short embroidery tutorial to get people working from home and to potentially get people excited about having the workshop in the future, whenever that may be. So I know that a lot of us are self-isolating, and I know from experience that having a craft or hobby to work on is really helpful. It's a stress reliever and it gets you thinking about something else than what's going on out in the world right now. So today I'm going to teach you 3 different stitches, which are my go-tos when I'm hand embroidering. They're really simple to learn and they are very versatile, so you can use them in a lot of different types of designs. I'm also going to go through all the materials you'll need to gather. I've kept it pretty simple so that you don't have to gather too much stuff and that you're not spending too much money either. Alright, so let's get going. Alright, so here are the basic materials you'll need for embroidery. I've made this as simple as possible so that it is as easy as possible to get the materials. These are the basics you'll need. You can get more stuff if you want, but you might not need everything else. This is just the basics. So first off, we have fabric. So I highly recommend 100% cotton for the fabric because it doesn't stretch and it has a really nice weight to it and is easy to sew into. You can also use linen or poly cotton, but I would stay away from anything that has a stretch to it because that is a lot harder to stitch, like embroider onto, and it might be quite frustrating when you're first starting off. Then we have our embroidery hoops. These guys come in a lot of different sizes and you can get them at many stores, Walmart, craft stores, sewing stores, online, and sometimes the dollar store has these as well. They're pretty cheap overall and they come again in lots of different sizes. Then you will need your embroidery needle. So these guys are a bit different than sewing needles because they have a wider hole, like a wider eye of the needle. And the reason for that is that the embroidery floss is actually quite thick compared to regular sewing thread. It is 6 different strands of thread all twisted together to create a thicker floss. Embroidery floss, there's a lot of different brands that you can get. And for the purpose of this, it doesn't really matter. Whatever you can find is good. But I am using DMC floss for this tutorial. I quite like the weight of it, and there are a lot of colors available in DMC floss. And then for the needles, I forgot to mention, these are also very easy to find, and they usually come in a pack, so you've got lots of different needles and sometimes different lengths, which is nice. Then you'll need really sharp scissors or snips. And the sharper the better because you want to be able to cut your floss as cleanly as possible. Finally, I would recommend getting some sort of pen to transfer your image onto your fabric. So if you have at home pens or pencils, you can use those. However, they will not wash off of your fabric, so you might have lines on your fabric that you don't want there. These guys are the Dritz heat erase pens. They come in a pack, I think, of 5 or 6 different colors. And what's great about these is that when you draw onto the fabric, if you make a mistake, you can just take an iron and iron it out and it disappears. So these guys are really nice that way. There are also on the market water-soluble pens. So those ones come out when you spritz your fabric with water or you submerge it into water. However, those are, from my experience, I don't like those as much because if you're drawing and you make a mistake, you have to wait for the fabric to dry after you spritz it before you can restart on your drawing. So it just takes time and it's kind of a waste of time. So these guys are the ones that I recommend. That's it. That's all you need to start your embroidery project. So first step is to stretch your fabric onto your hoop. As you can see, the hoop has 2 parts to it. It has an inner hoop and an outer hoop. And basically you're going to take your inner hoop and you're going to place your fabric over top of it. And notice how I made the fabric square when I cut it out. I made it overlap the inner hoop so that it's not coming right up against the hoop. And then we're going to take our outer hoop with the screw on it and we're going to place it over top of the fabric, like so. And then we're going to tighten the screw at the top. And we're also going to pull the fabric on all sides to make the surface of your hoop as flat as possible. There. And it should sound a bit like a drum. And that's how tight you want it. You want it to be as flat as possible, no wrinkles. So that's step number 1. Step number 2 is threading your needle. So for that, we need your needle and we need a piece of thread of embroidery floss. So on one end, I have made a knot, a double knot, and this is what's going to sit on the back side of your fabric. So you want it to be thick enough of a knot that it's not going to come through when you're stitching. And then on this side, this is the side that we're going to thread. So I'm going to cut it so it's as sharp as possible. And then, as yucky as it is, it does help to add a little bit of spit on the side to get it through the needle hole. There we go. And then it slides a lot easier. There are these little contraptions called needle threaders, and those help you thread the floss through the eye of the needle. But since they're not really essential to the whole embroidery process, I didn't add them into the materials list. So that is step 1 and step 2. So for step 3, I've actually already drawn out the design that I'm going to be showing you just to make the video go by a little bit faster. And I used my heat erasable pen for that. So for each stitch, I've actually already stitched it out for you so that you can see what it looks like. We have the back stitch, which is a stitch that allows you to do one continuous line without any interruptions. Then we have the satin stitch, which is a stitch that helps you fill in space, larger spaces quite easily and quickly. And it lies like really nice and flat and kind of looks like satin, I guess, like fabric. And then the last stitch that I'm going to show you is the French knot. So this one is what it sounds like. It's a little knot that sits on top of the fabric. This is my favorite stitch because it does add a lot of texture to your pieces, and you can fill in space quite nicely with this one as well. As you can see, I used the French knot there in the center of the flower. Then I used my satin stitch for the petals and the leaf, and then I used my back stitch, my straight line, for the stem. All right, so we're going to start with our back stitch. So for the back stitch, we're going to take our needle, our threaded needle, and we're just going to bring it to the back of the fabric, and we're going to start off right at the beginning of our line that we've drawn out. And we're going to push it through the fabric and pull all the way through, and our knot, see how it stops us from going any further. That's what we want. And now we want to create our first stitch. So the first stitch is what's going to dictate the size, or the length, I guess, of all the other stitches. Ideally, you want all your stitches to be the same length because that makes a cleaner line. So I'm going to pick the length of my stitch, and I'm going to put my needle back down through the fabric and pull all the way through. And there we go, we have our first stitch. So to keep going, I'm going to come up one stitch length away on the line, and I'm going to come up through the fabric from the back and pull all the way. And now I'm going to go backwards. So it is called the back stitch. So you're going back towards your initial stitch that you completed, and you're going to go back down through the fabric. And now you have your second stitch there. And then you're going to just keep going. So trying to keep the same stitch length, you're going to come up through the fabric, and then you're going to go back down through. You're going to come up through the fabric, and you're going to come back down, And ideally, again, you want to try to bring your needle back down through the fabric in the same hole as this stitch. So the hole that you created with this stitch, you want to go back down through that hole so that it is a nice clean line and that there's no gaps in your line. So it does take sometimes a bit of practice to get the same stitch length on your line, so don't be discouraged. It does take practice to do that. And it is nicer to start off with a nice straight line as opposed to like a wiggly line when you're learning how to do a back stitch. And there we go. So that's the end of my line. I have all my stitches nice and neat in a line, and there's no gaps in between my stitch. So now I have this loose tail here at the back. So I'm going to flip my piece over, and I'm going to show you, sorry I had to refocus there, I'm going to teach you how to knot it. So the best way to knot it is to take your needle and to just pull it through and create a knot. And now I like to put my finger down, sort of like when you're tying your shoe, I think, or just a pretty bow, to put your finger down so that the knot itself is as close to the fabric as possible. And this prevents the front side of the fabric from loosening, basically, from the stitches loosening. And then after you have your knot, you're just going to snip it away, and there we go. There we have our first stitch, the back stitch. For the second stitch, I'm going to show you the satin stitch. So for this one, we're taking our needle and we're going underneath the fabric again, and we're going to come up on the line that I drew out, so on that circle line, and we're going to come up as close as possible to your last stitch there so that there's no gaps again. You're going to pull the needle through the fabric, pull it tight so that the knot on the back of the fabric is resting close to the fabric. And then you're going to take your needle and you're going to go back down on the opposite side of your design as close as possible to your last stitch, and you're going to pull it through. And you've just added that stitch length to fill in that space. So to keep going, we just repeat that process. We come in at the bottom and we pull it all the way through, and then we go back down, making sure that you're putting your needle in on top of that line that you've drawn out, and then you're going back down. And so see here, I didn't quite put it close enough, and you've got like a little gap there. No big deal, we can always add another stitch really close to it to try to close the gap. For this exercise, honestly, you can make any shape you want and try to fill in any shape. A circle is nice and challenging because the stitch lengths change. If you just make it a square, you're gonna keep the same stitch length all the way through, versus a circle is a really great way to challenge yourself. And as you can see, I use the satin stitch again in the leaf and in the petals, and recreating these curves is the biggest challenge, I guess, when you're doing the satin stitch. And so that's why I picked a circle for you guys to practice your stitch on, so that you get all the practice that you need. So we go up at the bottom, up through the fabric, and then we go back down, 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 down. And then we have the same problem that we had before. We have our loose thread that we need to knot. So again, we're going to put this back on the tabletop, and then we're going to take our needle and we're going to loop it around, and we're going to hold it down tight and pull. And then we've got our little knot there to secure the thread. Perfect, and that is our satin stitch. So for the final stitch, we are going to do, again, the French knot. So this one is definitely the hardest out of the 3 knots, so don't get discouraged if you don't get it right away. It does take a lot of practice to get this one right. So the way that we do it is we take our needle and we bring it from the back of the fabric onto that dot that we've drawn out, and you bring it up to the top and pull all the way through. And now it is easiest if you actually put down your hoop onto a flat surface, so your tabletop or wherever you're working, for this next step. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the tail here that's sticking out and our needle, and we're going to bring it over here, and we're going to wrap around the thread around the needle, and then we're going to take the sharp part of the needle and bring it back down towards the back side of the fabric. All the while, you're going to take one hand and you're going to hold the loop nice and tight so that the knot is nice and tight, or else you get a loopy, yucky knot. And you pull it all the way through, and that is your little French knot. So again, I'm going to bring the needle up from the back of the fabric towards the top, pull it all the way through. I'm putting my hoop down. I'm taking the tail of the thread and the needle, and I'm going to wrap the thread around the needle once, taking the sharp part of the needle and bringing it back down towards the back of the design, holding the loop and pulling it all the way through, and then you create a knot. The more times you loop around your needle, the thicker your knot will be. So here I'll give an example of where I take the needle and I actually loop the thread around the needle once, twice, and then I go back down. And it might be hard to see in the video, but it does make a thicker knot than the rest. So I'll go do it one more time, pulling it through, wrapping around the needle once, twice, and then I'm going back down. So this one does take a lot of practice, but it is one of my favorite, oh my goodness, it's stuck. There you go. It is one of my favorite stitches because it does add a lot of texture and you can fill in space, and it just gives a little bit of variety to your stitch inventory. So those are the 3 stitches: back stitch, satin stitch, and French knot. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If people are digging it, then I might make more videos with different stitches as we go on, and hopefully we can have that workshop in the near future and I can teach all of this stuff to you in person, as if you have any questions, it is always easier to ask them in person than over social media or over the internet. Thank you so much for watching and following along, and I hope you guys have a really good day.